What's up, Gromies? Welcome to Office Hours, your source for free cannabis cultivation education. I'm your moderator, Keisha, and this is episode 82. Here's how we do it. I'll keep an eye out for questions in the chat. Drop them anytime, and if your question gets picked, we'll get right to it. We're also going live on YouTube, so if you're logging in over there, post your questions, and if yours gets picked, we'll do our best to cover it during the show. We are also live on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook, so same thing. Drop your questions in the chat, and we're going to get to as many as we can during the next hour. Before we get started, though, have you heard? Office Hours Live is headed to MJ BizCon, live and direct from booth 51005, and that'll be happening Thursday, November 30th as part of 3 days of amazing programming that we got going on. And there are two ways to tap in. You can join our live audience or watch our free live stream from anywhere in the world. Scan the QR code behind me. You see that? Look at that. The magic. And be sure to claim your spot. We would love to see you there. Now you know, be part of the experience. All right, Seth is in the house and Jason is coming in remote. How you doing, guys?
Doing well.
Pretty good. Yeah, I'm jealous of Jason's sunny location. But, you know.
California, I'm in California. It's not that sunny. It's a little chilly right now, but I think we're warmer than Pullman, right? I think we decided that.
I hope so, yeah.
Word. Well, let's get right to it. We got this question in from Matt right at the end of the show last week, so that's a good place to start. He wants to know, what's the best strategy from veg to flower going into slabs? Do you guys water heavy, then let dry back for a couple days, or do you guys set up the veg steer?
So I'll get started here. I mean, usually what we consider would just be rooting in process, and that's kind of set up for if you're flipping it flower. So you're going from you're transplanting it flower. So right at the time of flipping, you're putting probably 4x4 cubes right on top of the slabs. Obviously, you'll want your slabs to be hydrated appropriately and slit before you put your 4x4s on top. Definitely, if you have AROYA sensors, good time to get those in the slabs as well. And when we're talking about rooting in irrigations, typically we're shooting for pretty small irrigations. We might do 3 or 4 1% shots, maybe not even that. Best to look at your data and make sure that, hey, we are having some amount of total water content loss on a day-to-day basis. And usually we'll shoot for 3 or 4 days of that. And then sometimes we'll cut those back even farther if we need to get down to that, say, 45% water content range before we start our generative steering. What else, Seth?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing to keep in mind, right, is we've got that little 4-inch block that we're stacking on top. Immediately, gravity is going to take effect. Even if we're at 65% in that 4-inch block, all that water is going to go right down into the slab. And we're wanting to run that balance between overwatering the slab and also stimulating the root growth down into the slab by running it through the 4-inch cube. So just like Jason said, we're going for a small amount of 1% or less shots, and that's total slab or total media volume. But what we're looking for is never picking up or going above that shot size or frequency until we start to see about a 15 to 20% reduction in VWC. And what that's telling us is that we're actually getting enough open pore space for those roots to expand and that they have enough oxygen to actually do it. If we keep the slab too wet, typically we don't see a very good root in process, and we end up with, a level of rooting in, but kind of a weak root system and not necessarily that really aggressive root colonization and thick root formation that we see with a proper root in procedure. So as much as you want to push those early on, go for it. But at the same time, really make sure you're opening up that pore space and not overwatering the slab. And as Jason said, usually 4 days, sometimes we see out to 5, 7 till we start to see that overall dry back. And then, if it's taken longer than that, we kind of want to look at some of our environmental factors, make sure our relative humidity is in line, VPD is not getting too high, temps not getting too low, and what else did we want to look for there? Overall light input and any other factors that are influencing that dry back. Another big one is incoming plant quality. So if you're coming out of veg and we don't have a well-developed, and that's part of the advantage, by the way, of using the 4x4x4 or 4x4x2, with that smaller media, we're able to keep it heavily oxygenated during veg with a lot of pulsing and really push the formation of aggressive roots before transplanting that on. We want to have the healthiest possible plant at transplant to see the best rooting and success.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, in a well-run facility, building out SOPs, taking pictures of what does the roots look like on the bottom of your 4x4s, so your staff's familiar. Like, hey, maybe we need another day of veg on these plants. Making sure you're getting plant heights per strain. That'll also help you kind of judge what the right time to get those transplanted is.
Yeah, and personally in the past, I've worked with different strains, some of which root more aggressively than others, whether it's getting initial clone roots or even transplanting. So that's another
Mhm.
one of those things you want to pay attention to and decide if you need to, like Jason said, perhaps veg a little longer, or sometimes adjust our veg strategy. So we're really promoting that root production right before transplant.
Great advice. Thank you guys. That was my problem with my harvest, lack of harvest this year. I didn't root in properly, but I've learned a lot for next year. So awesome. All right, keeping it moving. We got a write in from Hydro Kruger. It's a couple of different parts, but let me get started with this first part. I grow indoors using LED lights, and I wanted to know what plant height do you recommend to avoid small larfy buds and to get nice big colas? Is there a plant height sweet spot when using LEDs to penetrate within the full canopy? For an example, I overgrew a plant in a 2-gallon pot that ended up being over 8 feet tall indoors using LED lights, and only the top colas were dense. Half the canopy was larfy because that LED light was too far to penetrate that far below. What do you guys think?
So we got basically a few variation factors in there. First off would be what type of LEDs you're using. Second off would be how do these strains perform? Basically, the morphology of that strain is going to dictate some ideal plant height. And then what works for the people on site. What types of efficiencies can you run for different plant heights? Maybe Seth, you want to elaborate on how those come into influence as far as determining best plant height for crop?
Yeah. Whenever we're talking about plant height, I mean, we want to look at, number one, are we growing a big or a small strain? That's going to influence kind of what we're looking for. If we have a plant that's 2 or 3x at stretch, okay, it's going to be easier to have a shorter plant. If we're growing something like a haze, an OG, any of those older sativa strains that we know stretch to 5+x, that's going to be a different strategy, right? And we're talking about plant height. There's two factors we're looking at that are really contributing. Number one is your flip height. If you were already vegging your plants for a month and a half, and starting to flip a 3-foot plant, okay, if we have a 2-3x plant, we're looking at 6 to 9 feet off that 3-foot plant. So that's one spot to start. The next is looking at your lighting source. We look at the type and style of LED, and then also the amount of power output. Just like with HPS, the more power we have coming out of that light source, the better canopy penetration we're going to get. And then looking at how high your light actually is above your plants. With a lot of, especially lower wattage LEDs, we're looking at a pretty, I mean, within 1 foot of your canopy, if we're in, a sub 700 watt LED, especially the panels. And then at that point, we're expecting to see, maybe 18 to 24 inches of decent penetration at most. So working off of that, you kind of want to look at, okay, how do I fill up this space with canopy and plant height wise? Really, probably in the 3 to 5 foot range is what you're looking at, just to have a decent, easy time getting to that plant structure. But the real big thing to look at is your light penetration and see how deep you can actually get that. And, for a lot of people, sometimes when they switch to LEDs, part of that strategy is moving to more smaller plants. That way they can fill that canopy out, and they're realizing, like, hey, I don't need 6.5 feet of plant height off of 4.5. I can still get a 2-foot canopy and be a little more compact. And that allows me to get that light down lower to the plants and get a little better penetration into that canopy. At the end of the day, that larfy bud forms because it's just not getting the right kind of light intensity. And really, a lot of times that has to do with flip height. It's surprising the amount of difference 1 or 2 inches can make on a final plant compared to flip height. So really take notes and, kind of pay attention to that. And then another thing we've discussed on this podcast many times before is your pruning strategies. So when you're going to set up your plant structure, when we're talking about LED production, for instance, and trying to produce high quality flower, if you're going for A grade, top shelf stuff, we're looking at that top, 12 to 18 inches of canopy. And if we're looking to maximize the growth there, we're going to take out a lot of that larf early on, go into that old school term lollipopping, but really aggressively pruning. So we're not wasting a lot of time growing that larf, only to either remove it towards the end of stretch or have a lot of larfy weed to deal with. So that's where you can kind of make your pick and say, what's my goal? What do I want to accomplish? And overall, I would say with the heights you're talking about, especially in a small grow, I would start flipping plants smaller and maybe going with more of them to achieve your same yields.
Yeah, and in traditional horticulture crops, there's a ratio called leaf area index. So if you're needing to actually set a number for this that you can standardize across how your strain performs and how you're operating, use leaf area index. Not the easiest thing to actually measure, but it's basically looking at light penetration through the canopy.
Yeah, and one of your best friends is going to be buying a light meter. You don't have to go too crazy high end on it, but just going in with some sort of meter and looking at how much light intensity you're losing going down through the canopy. Once you're hitting lower than 500 micromoles, roughly 450, we're going to see quite a bit of Larfy production. And that can help you make the call on how hard you want to prune and also how early you want to flip. So you're not having a plant that's super tall with just a tiny canopy on top. And, another thing to look at, we always talk about crop steering. If you let your plant get big enough in that 2 gallon and you can start to bulk it fairly aggressively, that's something we might end up seeing is if you're flipping a big plant in that 2 gallon, if that's getting enough dryback for you to get, several waterings on it throughout the day in your first 3 weeks, you're just pushing that to stretch. So that's another thing to look at too is, do you have a good plant to pot size ratio? And when we're talking about, a 3 to 4.5 foot plant, a 1 gallon is typically pretty good. Yeah. So just kind of look at all your factors and see where you want to end up. We usually prefer a shorter plant with more buds on it. That's kind of the profit mode in the cannabis industry right now.
So the next question they had, maybe we can give them a little guidance here. They wanted to know what plant height is best for 1 and 2 gallon pots so I don't overgrow. Would you recommend 2 feet plants in a 1 gallon pot by the end of flower? 4 foot plants max in a 2 gallon pot? What do you think?
Typically we see a 2 gallon pot can support a pretty big plant. In a 3 to 4.5 finished height, a 1 gallon is typically just fine. But that's the balance, right? What is your irrigation system like? Do you have the ability to water automatically or remotely if you're not there? And how high a stress situation do you want to run to push yields? If you're looking for, small batch, high quality, going with those 2 gallons is going to allow you to push it as generatively as possible. Your yields are going to take a hit, but that's going to be the lowest effort approach to growing the highest quality flower that you can. So to answer it, 3 to 5 feet for your plant size indoors is typically where we want to see it. If you want to go higher in that plant height, we're talking about that thicker canopy again. And that's where we typically see, commercial installations with 1,000-watt double-ended HPS lights or 2,000-watt LED lights that actually achieve that deep penetration. And a lot of times that's a pretty big step up in terms of room setup and equipment from a lower wattage LED or a small room setup. So if you are in a small room setup with lower wattage LEDs, growing taller plants is not going to help you produce any more flowers. So really adjusting, how often you want to harvest and how long you want to veg is going to be your 2 biggest tools there. And in terms of media, 1 and 2 gallon, like I said, the way to think about it is you'll have the opportunity to bulk that 1 gallon container more. The 2 gallon is going to be an easy, low effort approach. P1 waterings, you can run it super generative all the way through and produce some really high quality flower with probably mediocre yields, but depending on your application, perfectly happy. I know at home I play a lot with strains that don't take to bulking very well. So I run them super generatively. And since I'm not in business personally, that's fine. That achieves the result that I want to achieve.
Awesome, you guys. Thank you for that. All right. We got a question here from Jason. He wrote, in the greenhouse, my winter crop smokes black, but in spring, the same strains smoke and burn white. I understand that the carbohydrates in the flower are mostly responsible for this. How do we reduce the stored sugars in the bud? My thinking is that in the winter, the VWC is kept higher. What advice do we have for Jason?
You're dealing with
I'm
less.
start with just documenting light levels. And that'll give you kind of an idea of, all right, if you're not doing any supplementation, then here's what I'm going to expect as far as diminished inputs for these crops. And then you're going to have to make adjustments to the other variables to match those changes. If you do have supplemental, then kind of keep thinking about, hey, maybe I need more supplemental lighting. Make sure you're turning those lights all the way up when you need it. And one of my favorite ways in greenhouses is making sure that you're using conditional controls to turn up or down those lights based on the light intensity that's coming on from outside. That way you can match your DLI on a daily basis. And one of the nicest things about making sure that your DLI is the same every day is just being able to standardize how you irrigate from a day-to-day basis, rather than making irrigation changes based on what you expect that DLI to be for the day. You have a set parameter here that's determining at least that aspect of water usage.
Yeah, another big factor I've run into, especially up here in Washington in the winters, just the overall ambient temperature in the greenhouse. I know for us here, once you have that nice, not nearly as insulated roof as your walls, it becomes a lot more difficult to keep the heat up inside the greenhouse. And a lot of times it's kind of scary to watch that gas meter just start spinning real fast when you're cranking the heat in there. But yeah, that's what we're looking at is total overall energy inputs and the amount of both, light energy and radiant energy hitting the plant. More heat and more light are going to cause it to burn up those carbohydrates a lot faster. So trying to standardize everything from summer to winter as best you can. And then looking at, some other factors down the line, like, hey, are we pushing a high late nitrate load? Are we over fertilizing these plants and pushing them to produce more sugar at different times, given the changing environmental conditions? If we don't have as much light, if we don't have as much heat, and we don't have it dry enough in there, the plant can't actually, take advantage of those carbohydrates. They still have to move around within the plant. So if we don't have any water movement in the plant, those different carbohydrates are kind of just sitting there not doing much. The plant has to actually take in energy to do something with those.
So a lot more holistic approach that you described there, stuff to look out for throughout the cycle. Excellent. Thank you for that. Okay. Looks like Jason has a follow-up. Let's go with that follow-up. They want to know, what planting density do you recommend? We run one plant per 1 square foot, 3 to 4 feet plant height. What do you recommend for maximum production in a 4-liter pot? What I'm really asking is how much substrate volume per. What do you guys think?
So I'm hearing two questions here. One would be about substrate. One would be about plant spacing, if I heard that correctly. If you can get good light intensity, you're saying you're in a greenhouse. So in the summertime, that sounds 1 plant per square foot. It's pretty tight, right? Usually we're talking about having multiple plants per square foot, looking at the range of 0.6 plants per square foot would be pretty reasonable for something that size, maybe just a little bit tighter than that even. So
yeah, if you can get enough radiation in there to get that good penetration and allow those plants to spread out a little bit, we see strain dependent a lot of the best results between 9 and 12 plants per 4x4. For reference, that's a great way to think about it is all the pictures you see online of people running slabs. 3 slabs per light, 9 plants usually gives us pretty good results. And then from there, we're looking at, certain strain dependencies. I've certainly grown strains that we can run up at 14, 16 per light, but those are typically strains that do not branch out very well and or are like a semi-dwarf plant where I do have to pack them in to get that yield. But I'll say it again, 9 to 12 per light as a standard measurement is where most strains tend to land in most situations.
All right, you guys, thank you for that. Okay, keeping it moving. We got this in from Presidential Cannabis. They wrote in, would you say the most common tip burn looking deficiency would be from iron, calcium, and magnesium?
Possibly. I mean, most of the time when I see tip burn, it's just related to too low of nutrients and or other environmental factors. Unless you're mixing your own or using a non-standard salt that we see on the market.
Yeah, typically if you're seeing that burn, a lot of times it is low nutrient situation and heavy pH swings day to day as the plant's trying to cycle through that low nutrient load, where if we're running down at a 2, let's say a 2 EC in the substrate, that, number one might be on the ragged edge of adequate, or the plant might be taking up almost every good thing that we give it. And at that lower EC state, when the plant is chomping through those salts, it's swinging the pH pretty wildly day to day because there's not enough ionic load in the soil or in the substrate to compensate for that. So most deficiencies we see, just like Jason said, unfortunately, a lot of times the answer is more fertilizer and correct your pH. Once you start pushing these plants with high light, high CO2, controlled heat, now nutrition is one of the weaker legs in our system, right? And we've just got to provide enough. And, just for reference, a lot of times when you're seeing some yellowing, light green on new growth, that's we're looking at a deficiency. That tip burn is oftentimes related to either pH swing, or we definitely see this a lot, people wanting to push an extremely heavy dryback early on, especially in generative. If you want to take your cocoa plants down to like 12% VWC, anytime you hit that point, we're approaching temporary wilting point. And when that happens, the plant's going to drought response mode, which basically means that all the distal parts of the plant, every part that's farthest from the roots, aka your leaf tips, is the first part that's going to suffer because it takes so much energy to get water from the root zone to those marginal edges of the leaf. So that's the first spot you're going to see symptoms of over drying or a pH swing.
And so kind of the diagnostic steps in order would be take a look at your pHs, consider what EC you're feeding at. If you're already feeding at a low EC and you see those pH swings, pretty simple solution there would be increase your ECs, keep monitoring pH, see if that solves it. If you are in check on the other variables, sending in for a leaf tissue analysis is a really easy way to cost effectively and quickly diagnose specifically what elements are either in deficiency or excess.
Yeah. And, then going beyond that, you might be looking at some water quality issues or something like that. And then another thing to look at is your incoming water quality. Like, hey, is my feed water temp below 70 degrees Fahrenheit? If the answer is no, I mean, that's another thing we got to check and get in line to make sure we're getting good plant health. When we see symptoms on the plant, it's not always indicative of a particular deficiency unless we can eliminate a bunch of different things along that path. So usually plant nutrition is kind of the last spot. Most commercial fertilizers now are pretty darn adequate. I've grown plenty of not plenty, but as a tester, I've certainly grown some weed with Miracle Grow, and I can assure you it worked fine as long as I was keeping up on my parameters. So check everything holistically. And unfortunately, nutrient deficiencies seem like they're always going to be like that silver bullet. Hey, my problem's solved. But usually it's a fair bit more complicated than just switching your nutrient line.
I love that. Y'all are dropping the knowledge today. I love that you mentioned water temperature. We actually got a question that fits right in with that. Somebody submitted over Instagram. How would you make a feed if your well water is coming out at 1.2 EC? Got any advice?
The first thing you got to do is send in for water sample analysis. You have to know what's in that water in order to work with it. If we have some levels of calcium in there, that's some free nutrition. If we've got levels of chlorine or too much iron, then we know that we may need to be investing in an RO system in order to combat that, because we can't get rid of some of the nutrients that are in this solution coming in.
Yeah, I mean, that's your best first step. Get that analysis, because there are other things like bicarbonates and stuff as well that will cause precipitation of nutrients once you mix it, which will make it really difficult to achieve your target EC ratios and specific nutrient concentrations in solution. So get that test. And, if you're a commercial cultivator, I like to get that test and call the nutrient company. They should have an answer on what they recommend you do with their line in spite of this. And unfortunately, a lot of times it's going to be investing in an RO system or some other means of chemical scrubbing, depending on what's in your water. If it's coming out that high, I would definitely be worried about it being a little alkaline and having issues along those lines. Hopefully you get some good news back from the test, but it'll at least give you some insight on which direction to go.
All right, get that well water tested. Excellent. All right, switching gears. Another question from Instagram. Somebody wants to know, do you cut off CO2 and drop light levels by 50% in the last 10 days? What do you guys think?
I wouldn't drop light levels that much. Maybe for the last 5 days, you go down 20% or something. But typically, I like to keep my energy and CO2 levels pretty much at full potential until the end of harvest.
Yeah, especially with the shift to LED light, we're not getting a lot of radiant heat on those plants. We're not cooking the terps off of it later on, provided the rest of the ambient room temp and leaf surface temps are in line. There's not a lot of reason to try to restrict some of the two of the main things that do contribute to plant development. We already ideally are restricting nitrogen, not applying that as heavily, not pushing plant growth. We want that plant to be as healthy as possible coming into harvest, not declining in terms of overall plant health.
Cool. Thank you guys. Sorry, a lot of questions coming in. So trying to keep track of it. Thanks, y'all, for being patient with us. Trying to get to as many questions as we can. Thank you guys for that. All right. Keeping it moving. We got another question regarding Larfy buds. Somebody wants to know, would you cut off Larfy buds when you're at day 45?
Buy bubble bags.
Go ahead.
Buy bubble bags. Start making hash. At that point, you're throwing away. Past about the day 21, which is where we usually call the end of stretch for most strains, you're just throwing away money that you put into energy to produce that little larfy bud. So when you get a lot of that, sure, if you don't think there's anything you can do with that material, although on the commercial setting, that's called the weed that goes into your joints, goes into hash production, concentrates, etc. So next time, take notes, take pictures, and really document, like, hey, when did we do our first pruning and how did we do it? Because the other thing I've seen too is a lot of confusion around actual pruning. So if we go with a technique where we're stripping leaves at like day one early in flower, or not touching it till the end of flower, but all you're doing is stripping leaves and not actually removing those lower buds, you're going to end up with a lot of little larfy buds. So being thorough with your strip and then really tuning your pruning strategies to different strains, because some strains, there's a wedding cake cut I used to grow that I always use as an example, but that thing I would barely clean up the bottom because somehow it had the genetic potential to put out little golf balls down low. It was really good about tightening up those buds. Plenty of other strains I've grown just don't do that. So I know, okay, a few runs in, if I don't do that cleanup hard enough, early enough, I'm going to end up with a lot of little buds. And then that does relate back to our plant height discussion. If you're flipping a big plant, you want to work with the plant, not fight it in terms of growth. If you're growing a lot of matter only to chop it off, that's a wasteful process. So now we're looking at, okay, flipping a smaller plant, we're going to get better light penetration and have to do less work on it.
Fantastic. Awesome, you guys. All right. Keeping it moving here. Now, Smokey submitted this question. Thank you again for following up with us, Smokey. We get a lot of questions and can't get to everything, but glad you are on top of it. So I'm going to read all of this, and I think we're going to talk about it. All right. So, hello. I am having some discoloration inside of my flower before and after harvest. I don't notice any mold, but it looks like a very light green color to almost white. The outside of the flower looks great. This is only happening with a couple strains in the room. I have added a ton more airflow to the room to try and correct this problem, but it seems to still be happening. I run in cocoa at 2.5 to 3 EC, CO2 1000, PPFD 900, 1.4 VPD. Any ideas what's happening? And then let me read you the follow-up. This is week 6. Temps are 80 and 50 to 55, humidity most of the time. I don't see any browning on the stems, just this really light color. It's only happening with the large bud plants. So that's the first part of the questions. What do you guys think?
Probably sounds like we have botrytis issues. It's hard to say without actually looking at the buds. Certain genetics are especially susceptible to botrytis. It's an unfortunate reality. One thing, I know Jason's seen this in the past. There's some strains, it's just heartbreaking. You grow these big old baseball bats and then you break them open and you find mold, like, a couple days before harvest, or You don't see it at harvest, but by the time you've hung those plants up in a few days that it takes them to dry down, that bud rot's really hit. One thing to focus on is your nighttime VPD, and then starting to do some dew point calculations to make sure you're not actually hitting any condensation events inside the room. With those bigger buds, what we see is a lot of times people, we want to cool it down, try to push that overnight diff to bring out that purple, but if you're not careful, you can accidentally hit a dew point event. And whether it's condensation coming from the ceiling of your greenhouse or grow room, or those plants actually getting cold enough to have condensation on them, once there's liquid on there, there is no drying out that bigger bud. And if the plant's susceptible, you're probably going to have botrytis. Most of us can't really afford to run a surgically clean room. And if you're, anywhere where agricultural production happens, which is, most of the country, except for in pretty urban areas. And even in those, fruit trees, rose bushes, a bunch of the plants that we like to have around us outside are hosts for botrytis. So much like aspergillus, good old bread mold, it is pretty ubiquitous to our environment. So making sure your nighttime VPD is in line, making sure when you cross temperature barriers, you're not accidentally hitting dew point, and then understanding that when you go below 70 degrees Fahrenheit, you're opening up, especially at night, you're opening up opportunity for a lot of pathogens to form because they bloom essentially, in the 50 to 70 degree range, not in 75 to 85, for instance. So that nighttime VPD is really, really important when we're looking at that. And then knowing that some of these diseases are ubiquitous in the environment, or at least their spores are, looking at how we can go about, either saying, hey, this plant's not practical to grow here. I need to, this is where pheno hunting becomes fun. If you're, I used to say we did a lot of mold screening when we did our pheno hunts, but that was something we had to look at. If we pop 20 seeds, that's an evaluation factor here. Like, did any of them not mold? If it didn't mold right there, that's a selection trait for us as a big winner in the greenhouse, because seasonally, that's a huge challenge. And then, if you're determined to keep some of those genetics, like many of us are, finding alternative strategies to reduce that bud size. So that's where, we typically talk about not topping, not doing things like that. But this is where, one thing I've had success with in the past is a late topping towards the end of week 2, beginning of week 3. I'll go take off all of my apical buds that I know are going to form my strong dominant big nugs. And really just, I know that I'm sacrificing yield, but if I was going to drag a bucket around and throw away a bunch of product anyways in a month and a half, let's just get it out of there and try to reduce the contamination risk.
Yeah, and basically, my approach, hitting everything that Seth would hit here as far as environmental factors and plant stuff. I would also just try and understand: is this uniform across my strains? What is the susceptibility point in this? Is it in a specific area in the room? And then kind of analyze it from there. If it's ubiquitous across all crops and all the room, then it's probably going to be absolutely environmental, or maybe something related to plant health that you can work on. If you do find something that is more isolated, like I said, per strain, then work on that strain. Try and identify some management points. Maybe we need to do a little bit more crop management or canopy management on that specific strain. Maybe we need to get it in a slightly higher airflow area. If we do have striations in airflow, then you did say that you've increased your airflow, but is that airflow uniform across the room? So bringing canopy management into there and isolating the circumstance might also be helpful.
Yeah, one of my favorite things to do if I'm finding mold in a room and I just can't find, where is this coming from, what's going on, is to try to get in there during a cold event or right after the room starts warming up. But look up. We have a lot of cables strung around these, a lot of conduit in these rooms. Oftentimes we've got things like dehues that are actively pulling water out of the air, so there can be leaks there. There can be condensation inside the unit. We talk about ACs or ducting. That can be a huge issue. I've seen plenty of times where an uninsulated duct will form a lot of condensation on it. And then we extend that to like light fixtures, cables, and all these things that have, they're not designed with a shape that allows water to drip to the sides of the room. So anywhere that cable's dipped, anywhere on that fixture that condensation can drip off, once that hits a bud, that's going to form mold, and that can sometimes look very sporadic across your facility, make it really hard to figure out what's going on. And since also generally most of us aren't just standing in the room when the lights turn off and turning on a green light and staring at the ceiling looking for drips, it's hard to spot those. I mean, you've got quite a few square feet and it's dark in there. No one's in there. So it's tough to have eyes on some of those dew point events. And that's why it's good to look at just a small dew point calculator, and you can look back and see if it's likely that you have been hitting it or not. And then also looking at, hey, some of these, uh, I don't want to say micro events, but sometimes when your AC kicks on, you're going to have a condensation event just on the ducts, things like that. So really trying to identify, like, is it susceptible? Is it a susceptibility issue? Is it a VPD issue? Or, is it just a machinery issue in the facility? And I need to adjust my set points to make sure that I'm not accidentally introducing any liquid moisture into the room that I don't want to.
You guys gave a lot of great advice to Smokey. The other part of their question was, could this be a result of underfed plants or higher VPD swings, or maybe just blowing up the buds too big for the EC that's available? But it sounds like you gave all the different considerations and things that he needs to be taking a look at this point. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And that's the other thing, when we're talking about IPM and plant health, your first best defense is healthy plants. Deficient plants get sick easier. They can't, they're not as sturdy. They can't resist invasion by fungi. So plant health is always at the core of this. And that also ties into our environment. If your environment's been out of line for quite a while, your plant health might not be quite as optimal as you'd hoped, and your plants are more susceptible to infection.
Awesome, you guys. Thank you. Good luck out there, Smokey. Keep us posted. All right. We got another question in from Instagram. Somebody wants to know, what do you guys recommend for feed environments for the first 10 days? So looking for some parameters.
First 10 days of the plant's life.
Yeah, I think that's
so basically clone feeds. It's going to be dependent on the nutrient manufacturer. We've got some nutrient manufacturers that are currently actually successful feeding near full strength. So I know some of the most common ones on the brands right now are you're looking at 2.5 to 3.5 for clone feed strengths. Historically, with some of the nutrients we're used to, it's a little bit lower than that until those plugs have rooted in, and then we'll move up. So I would reference your nutrient manufacturer for places to start with.
Yeah, typically, so right as Jason said, right around a 3.0 is where we're seeing a lot of them come in. One of the biggest things you want to be careful for, and this is where I highly recommend people invest in some sort of a scale or load cell for your clone room. But you can start keeping track. One way I like to do it is just a little piece of masking tape or a clipboard, but keep track of each tray or measure a few and try to see, like, hey, we want to see, 30 to 50% of the water come out of that block of cubes before we water it again. And then, on top of that, making sure that you're burping your domes effectively and keeping your clone room clean. That's an eternal challenge when, for most of us, our clone room is usually jam-packed with clones. It's not exactly empty enough to just go nuke that thing out with some heavy-duty cleaning sprays. So cleaning as you go is ultra important. And then also, really watching your clones and finding out, like, hey, I've seen situations where we suddenly have a mold infection in one tray. Okay, anyone that goes in the clone room needs to know how to, number one, check all the trays. Number two, identify that. Number three, start filling out paperwork to throw that tray away and get it the heck out of your clone room so it's not starting to infect other trays. And then working backwards, hopefully, to go, okay, what day did we take this clones? What was going on? Let's do a little investigation and see where this point of infection came from. Did it come in off of the mom? Did an employee bring it in the room? Did someone leave a banana peel in the trash can for a week because no one was cloning in there for a week? Where did that come from? So, and then the other thing with clones, is a stable environment. If your clone room is the last thought in setting up your whole grow, you might want to revisit how well you're able to maintain temperature and humidity in there, because the younger the plant is, the more susceptible it is to environmental swings. And that doesn't just go for clones rooting. That goes for clones rooting into your initial media, whether that be a 1-2 gallon or a 4x4x4, or anytime you're rooting in. So we want to make sure it's warm, leaf surface temp up near 80 to 82. Want humidity to be pretty high in that 0.6 to 0.9 range VPD, and not have it dip down a bunch overnight, basically. Want to keep those plants really babied in their happy zone so they can focus on rooting and not have to spend a bunch of time opening and closing their stomata to try to adjust to that swinging VPD in the room.
So you guys, I think I phrased this question more for the first 10 days, but they're really asking for environmentals for the feed environments for the last 10 days.
The last 10 days of flower?
Mm-hmm. They
Okay.
just said last 10 days.
So ripening, we're looking at trying to run a higher VPD just to avoid some of the mold situations like we were talking about before. If you keep your VPD in that 1.3 to 1.6 range day and night as a goal, it's pretty likely that you're not going to run into any dew point issues. However, a bunch of people listening to this will definitely say that's impossible at 65 to keep it that high, depending on your HVAC setup. So that's where you kind of start to draw some lines and evaluate where you want to take your risks. If I'm dipping down to a 0.5 VPD, going down to 65 degrees, but at 70, I keep it at 1.1 overnight. Personally, I'm going to choose 70 because I know my chances of mold are going to be way less than down at 65, and I'd rather harvest usable bud, not moldy bud. And then other than that, we're looking at trying to achieve at least a 10-degree ambient room temp differential. The bigger your differential, not necessarily the colder, but the wider the spread is what's going to really affect that purpling coming out. So yeah, we want to run it typically depending on HPS or LED, but we want our leaf temps to be 75 to 77 in the daytime, maybe up to 78, 79. And then we're going down to about 65 degrees at night, provided you can keep VPD in line, which most cases, that's going to be 43 to 45% relative humidity at 65 degrees. So that becomes a challenge. But also when we're looking at those room environments, you don't want to ignore the substrate. We want to be in a substrate size that's a substrate that is appropriately sized so that you can run a full 22-hour dry back and really push some of those ripening characteristics. And the big thing here is consistency. We want to be able to go straight over to generative and not go generative for a few days and then start to add more P2s and just vary it up. We want to be able to be consistent and nail that every time, which starts way back in veg when we look at plant uniformity and how we're treating those plants throughout the entire process.
I mean, an overview of optimal environmental conditions from root in to ripening. There you go. Good luck out there, y'all. It's amazing. I learned so much on this show. All right, keeping it moving. Spinoza 415 dropped this question. What's the highest EC you would push in the substrate given you have optimal environmentals and light intensity?
Seems
That's a loaded
really
one.
good situations where we're feeding it a little over 4 EC.
Yeah, once we get PPFD up into that 1250 plus range, those plants can actually eat through close to 2,000 ppm of salt every single day. So we are feeding up into that 4 range. And as far as baseline ECs go, while we're looking at maybe a 4 to a 6 under HPS, a lot of times when we see really high intensity LEDs come into play, I'd be pushing that up to like an 8 to 11 baseline EC, and then quite a bit higher is all I'm going to say on that dry back, depending on what phase of growth you're in. So the key, though, is not shocking your plants. You want that EC to ramp up throughout your stretch at a pretty consistent rate. We don't want to be playing this game where you're spiking it up and flushing it out, spiking it up and flushing it out. We want that to be a nice day to day. If we looked at that low point EC and the upper point, we want both of those lines to be linear, not exponential, up or down. And if you can't, and this is where, like Jason's saying, feeding at a 4.0 or even 4.5 sometimes, we're only doing that when you see that the plant is absolutely using up so much that you're unable to stack more EC into that media. But again, the key is that even stack. If I hit the end of stretch and I've only achieved 4.5 EC as the baseline of my media, if I continue to try to jack that up during that time period or raise that throughout bulking, that's not going to be the most optimal for the plant to push more flower production. We're introducing stress at a time that we kind of don't want a whole lot of it. Ideally, our EC range is actually going to go, not the overall range shift down too much, but the difference between the EC at the wettest point and the driest points of the day is going to be smaller during bulking, just because we're watering later out into the day and experiencing a smaller dryback. So the answer is, if everything else is in line, pretty high. With these LEDs, that's what's been kind of driving this, is growers out there going like, hey man, everything's perfect. Why am I seeing these bleached buds on my LED plants? This room is like it's the Ferrari of grow rooms. I have everything ready to go. And like, I know, compared to older knowledge that I had, I'm feeding these things adequately, when in reality, there's just not enough EC for the plant to build more tissue.
Yeah, and just clarification for listeners here, when Seth is talking about baseline EC there, we're looking at time series root zone EC data, and that's basically the root zone EC after irrigations, right? So probably the lowest point in the day.
Yep. If you're, a Solus user out there, right at the end of your P1 irrigations, when you actually hit field capacity and achieve true runoff, not channeling, that's when we want to look at our baseline EC.
I love it. So while we are on the topic of EC, we just got this question. What is a good EC in flower till the end?
So typically, I like to recommend a fairly easy system in which we're modulating our irrigation sizes based on how much runoff we are getting and how much EC we want to build up in the substrate. So typically, from day one of flower to right until ripening, we'll push those full ECs. So anywhere in the ranges, usually, like it says, 3 to 4, depending on light source and environmental parameters. That being said, during ripening, that's kind of one of the areas where you may or may not make some EC adjustments. Typically, if we're not reducing the nitrogen load in our nutrients, we'll talk about going half to 3/4 nutrient strength. So reducing that EC, decrease the nitrogen availability to the plant. That being said, if you are substituting and getting rid of the nitrogen, I'll typically stick between 3/4 and full strength nutrients even through ripening.
Yeah, and if you don't have 24/7 time series EC monitoring, it's really hard to pinpoint that point in plant development where the plants start to enter senescence and stop uptaking a vast majority of nutrients. So if you're blind, keep it simple. That's my best advice. Just like Jason said, run the manufacturer's recommendation, full strength, especially, now that we're seeing more finishing products coming out from various manufacturers. That eliminates a variable. And when we're guiding those plants right into harvest, we don't want to shift that EC range too much too quick, because that's when we'll see, basically root health complications, and then, hanging a potentially not optimal plant.
Great overview, guys. Thank you for that. All right. Frank, unfortunately, sounds like he's dealing with russet mites. So he's looking for any advice on dealing with russet mites in mid to late flower.
Go into your flower room last.
Our condolences.
Don't go from the flower room to the veg room. There's, one of your best friends is going to be trying to maybe order some beneficials. Go check out Coppered or Arbico and see what they've got on there for russet mites. I know there's quite a handful out there that you can use. At this point, you can play with spraying some sanitizers. Those probably aren't going to do the trick. I would avoid spraying too much, just because you don't want to be smoking that stuff later. And then at this point, man, go buy some duct tape and tape your door shut every night. I mean, that's about all you can do. There's old school techniques, sulfur fumigation. That's not that great. That's going to leave residue on your plants and walls. So quarantine. When you finish this round, nuke that thing out. Don't be scared of bleach. Don't be scared of pyrethrins. Really go hard on it. And yeah, make sure you don't drag it backwards in the cycle. Depending on how big your facility is, or if you're lucky enough to live in a place where you have access to, let's say, a buddy or a different farm or whatever that you can source clean genetics from again, um, really try to go investigate how extensively those russet mites have infected your facility. And hey, if you're finding them in the moms, in the veg, just absolutely everywhere, start nuking it out and get ready for a reset. That's about the best you can do. And be rigid from now on about your IPM protocols going in. And at this point, now that you know you have them, we're looking at most likely a couple knockdown sprays going into flower with various heavy duty pesticides before bud set, and then moving pretty immediately to a beneficial insect program. Get those beneficial bugs in there early before your populations get out of control. And then, another thing I like to point out to people before we started seeing the good old yellow sticky traps show up in cannabis grows, their traditional application, the reason they have little square inch grids on them is so you can throw those out for a certain time period, count how many bugs you actually get on a card, and establish levels of infection and levels of action that says, like, hey, if I get X amount of russet mites overnight on this card, that means I need to spray. If I see that I've got over X amount, okay, now they've gotten out of control. This is a heavy action item, and start establishing protocols. That way you stay on top of it, because there just isn't a whole lot we can do once bud set has happened to kill the bugs and preserve a good crop.
Frank, sorry you're dealing with that, but that's the advice. And, let us know how it works out. Good luck. All right. We got another question here from YouTube. Johnny writes, how are you guys? Love you guys' show. I have a question. What's the best method for irrigation strategy for 10-gallon pot from week 1 to week 8? I know not the best pot size, just need to finish this round. What advice do we have for Johnny?
10-gallon. Well, hopefully we're outside or in a high intensity greenhouse, hopefully somewhere more southern than Seth and I usually. If you're in 10-gallon, hopefully you've got a really large plant and you're going to be able to do a few more irrigations than a typical indoor size plant. And we're just talking about that because in a 10-gallon plant or a 10-gallon substrate, let's say field capacity, I'd say 45%, maybe if it's a soil or a perlite.
I would hope you'd have a lot of perlite in there in the 10-gallon. That way we're, those big pots, it's when you go above low 30s in water content, we typically see some root rot starting to happen.
Yeah. And so an example, I'm just trying to give, an idea of how often you'd need to irrigate that. So let's say it's 30%, right? I mean, we got lots of perlite in that 10-gallon. So that's 3 gallons of water holding capacity. On a typical 3 to 5 foot size plant, we might only see a quarter to half gallon of water usage a day from evaporation and transpiration that plant's using. So if we got 3 gallons of available water, that means we're needing to replenish every, say, 6 to 10 days of full amount of water. So that might mean we only need to irrigate every 3 to 5 days. And so I guess the best thing that you can be doing there is just monitoring how much water content you have. And if you are pushing more generative, wait for those larger drybacks before you do irrigate again. If you are trying to do a vegetative, maybe half, do that timeline in half and do a few irrigations throughout.
Yeah, and if you're going to be using the 10-gallon pots for a long term of time, that's just what you found you really like and seems to work for your particular product quality. You might want to look into getting a soil moisture potentiometer. That's going to allow you to pretty easily, it's not going to give you VWC, it's going to give you negative pressure, but you can start steering in the similar way that grape growers and raised bed growers grow, which is keeping that substrate within a range that will equate to, usually 20 to 30% water content. But you can at least get some sort of number, because obviously picking up a 10-gallon pot's not going to be the easiest all the time, especially if you got a bunch of plants. But getting some level of measurement on it so you can start to decide when you're going to irrigate, because as Jason said, a lot of the times we're looking at a long dryback, many, many days. Okay. In that situation, if we can put numbers on it, we can start to say, okay, we're going to water every day, but we're not going to bring it back up to field capacity necessarily every day. And that's where some different feeding strategies come in. As far as getting this crop out, I'd keep it simple. Probably make sure it gets runoff every other day at the minimum, and start going from there. Keep it simple. I mean, a lot of us for years grew in big pots, just watering every morning and wait until the next day. Go water the garden in the morning, then go about your day.
Today's theme is keep it simple. I love it. All right. Thank you for that question, Johnny. Good luck out there. All right. Carlos wrote in, going from generative to vegetative, pour water EC 12 to 6. I lowered EC down from the previous 2 days and wanted to ask, how do I time my P2s now that I'm not going so hard on dryback? I'm doing 2 hours after saturation to reach max VWC and maintaining the same 5 to 10% dryback up until 2 hours before lights out. Is that okay to go into vegetative bulk?
It sounds like that's a little bit more of a generative strategy and too small of a substrate. Typically, 5 to 10% between irrigations is going to be less vegetative than usually what we're shooting for. So most of the time when I'm in a vegetative state, I try to determine, well, how hard am I trying to steer vegetatively, right? And that'll determine the number of irrigation events and how long my irrigation window is. So when I always talk about your irrigation window, it's from first irrigation to last irrigation throughout the day. Typically for P1s, we'll get to field capacity within about an hour of that first irrigation. And then for P2s, we'll talk about usually say 5 to 7 or 8 hours of irrigation window for P2s. A lot of times I just start with a general place and go, so I'll irrigate once an hour. And those don't necessarily have to bring you up to field capacity. They are going to stabilize your EC. So you don't need to necessarily make EC changes in your feed EC. And I guess another thing to kind of keep in mind there is how fast your drip rate is on those emitters. If we've got a really high drip rate, we might just do twice as many irrigations.
Yeah, I mean, I would say if you don't have time series data to really help you out determining how quickly that dryback post P1 is happening, our goal is to let it dry back just long enough that we're exceeding the amount that we're going to put on in those P2 shots, right? We don't want to be bouncing off field capacity and flushing out that media in the afternoon. So if you're doing it blind, putting, a 1 to 1.5 hour gap in between the end of your P1s and the beginning of your P2s, and then shooting for a more like a 1 to 2% shot on those P2s. As Jason said, starting every hour is a great place to start, especially if you can accurately get down to a 1% or less irrigation. If you don't have technology to look at, you can always use your good old eyeballs and go in there and make sure you're not pushing runoff with any of your P2s. That's the main goal here. If we could look at a chart, the peak of those P2s can be a horizontal jigsaw. It can be a jigsaw that's angled down, like a really simple drawing of some mountains. But what we don't want to see is that jigsaw topping out at our field capacity at every point and just flushing that media out. And as Jason said, the more vegetative we want to go, the more bulking you're going to do. But an important thing to remember is that when you're first making that switch, we might start out with 2, 3, maybe 4 max P2s on that first day. And then as that plant gets more and more into that bulking mode, it's going to drink more. So you're going to go back and start adding those P2s over that next week or two and pushing it harder and harder. The flip has always got to be gentle. It's not going to happen overnight. Sometimes it can if you're on the ragged edge of plant to pot size, in which case, I'm going back to looking at graphs of Hugo's. A lot of times that's what we see. They're ready to go, but then now we can't go back generative at the end.
Awesome, you guys. Thank you. We have 1 minute left, but we covered IPM a little bit today, and somebody wrote in asking for advice on cleaning between runs. If you have any advice on cleaning products, what would you recommend at what dilution? They're wondering, when cleaning pots, trays, and floors, would you go with bleach and how much per gallon? Any insights you have just based on your experience in commercial cultivations? Good cleaning products, bleach. What do you guys think?
Bleach is great. Get good industrial grade bleach though, if you can. If you go to Walmart or your local grocery store and get bleach, that's usually a 6% dilution rate. And you want 0.5 to 1.5% bleach to do a decent sanitizing job, usually leaning on the heavier end. So if I get a 6% bleach gallon, that's only going to make what, 6 gallons total of cleaning solution. So keep that in mind when you're buying bleach. It's not like doing laundry where we just put a little tiny cup full in the whole thing. We actually want it to be fairly strong. And then hypochlorous acid, Sanidate, having a few different modes is always a good idea. So hitting it with something like bleach, and then, bleach, at least 2 sanitizers, and then good old elbow grease. So my favorite is a pressure washer. you know, I've seen some pretty sweet setups with steam cleaners and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, these grow rooms get filled with living gunk. We get biofilm all over everything. There's dust. No amount of just spraying is really going to get rid of getting in there and scrubbing out the facility and getting in the nooks and crannies. And once you start dealing with different pests, you might even find you happen to have a caulk gun around, and now you're in there caulking up the corners of your rooms and your expansion cracks, and then starting to eliminate the spots where you find dust and organic matter buildup in your room. And then, don't neglect some of those important areas. Like, my rule, top to bottom, everything falls down. So I like to start cleaning at the top of the room. I like to get up there. Compressed air is always one of my great friends. Get in there with the mask on, blow out the top of the room, wipe everything down. If you can pressure wash, that's always the best. And then do your sanitizing washes, bleach, Sanidate, hypochlorous. And then finally, clean your drains. I think that's something that does get overlooked sometimes, especially if you're fortunate enough to have a drain setup that's not always plugging with cocoa or perlite. You might not be paying as much attention to those as needed. That's a good connection point. So making sure you sanitize your drains. And then, probably one of the big things that I run into is contamination coming from the irrigation system. So if you can, as much as you clean that room, if your pipes right once they hit the hallway are filthy going back to your main water supply, all you're doing is injecting pathogens into that room every time you irrigate. So cleanliness all the way through. And once you start finding those, always track everything back to that point of infection. But man, yeah, I can't stress enough the elbow grease. I wish there was a magic bullet there or some sort of fumigation that made it all better. But
Yeah,
you got to get the
be
filth
thorough with
out.
it.
Yep.
Roll up those sleeves.
Mhm.
Yeah. I was going to second the pressure washer there. It's doesn't it's a good practice to spray, scrub, and pressure wash basically. And one of the last steps that I like, if you can in your facility, do like a chlorine dioxide fogger.
Yep.
Get that room to have a cleaning agent atomized in there. Obviously, there's some health considerations and equipment maintenance stuff that you got to keep in mind. So it is to only be used in the right application, but it can make wonders as far as getting to the nooks and crannies that you can't get with a sponge.
Yeah, and like back to our russet mite comment. I gotta throw this in there, Keisha. Once the plants are out of the room too, there's this concept called a bug bomb, but basically using pyrethrins and other things that you didn't want to spray on your active buds and treating the room in the downtime. So you're getting, not just sanitization, but also poison for specific pests that you're targeting. But don't give up. That's the key. Go to work every day and keep it clean,
Yeah. Oh my God, you guys gave such great advice today. This is a juicy show. All right, we're going to wrap it up a little. We're running a little late, but I love it because that means we had a lot covered. Thank you, Jason, Seth, and our producer, Chris, for another great session. Just a quick reminder, Office Hours Live will be headed to MJ BizCon. We're going to be live and direct from booth 51005 on Thursday, November 30th. You can tap in, be there live, be there in the virtual live stream, scan this QR code and sign up so we can keep you posted on everything that we're doing. And we look forward to seeing you in Vegas. Thank you you all for joining us for this week's AROYA office hours. We do this every Thursday, and the best way to get answers from the experts is to join us live. To learn more about AROYA, book a demo at AROYA.io. One of our experts would be happy to walk you through all the ways the platform can improve your cultivation production process. While you're there, sign up for our newsletter and stay up to speed on all things AROYA. If you have a topic you'd like us to cover on office hours, if I didn't get to your question this week, it's all good. Post your questions anytime in the AROYA app. Drop your questions in the chat on our YouTube. Send us an email to sales@aroya.io. DM us on all the socials, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, LinkedIn, Social Club. We want to hear from you. And we'll send everyone in attendance a link to today's video and post it in the AROYA YouTube channel. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share while you're there. See you at the next session. Thanks, everybody.